High School. This is Advanced CX Debate and X's and O's approach. They are filming this session, so all rights are given to UIL and Salado Film to do stuff with, and that's great. I did not turn this into the collective suppository of information. Is that what that's called? Depository? Whoops. That's on film. You're welcome. No, there you go.
Thank you.
But there is a tiny URL up here that's a lot easier to, calm down, Telly, a little easier to go to. Don't jump ahead of me though, because then some of the fun will not be there. So,
Corey, can you tell us what the URL is?
yeah, it's tinyurl.com/XOCC18. You might want to put it in all caps. I'm not sure if it's case sensitive. Like the XOCC18 part. But again, go to that afterwards. Just hang with us for a little bit. We can tell this is a good church-going crowd here, so we'll have some good fun. So yeah, I did put my email address on this slide, so if you want to write that down, go ahead. So if you have any questions or you want to email me, whatever, we can chit-chat and all that kind of stuff. I am at Lindale High School. I am excited to do this presentation. I haven't done a CX one in a long time. We have had some amazing success at Lindale High School over the last couple of years. So I think that's why Jana asked for this. My goal in this session is to it is an advanced session. However, we'll slow down. Please, if you're a new coach, definitely feel empowered to raise your hand, ask some questions. That'll help get us to the right amount of time and stuff too. But this is an advanced session. We'll kind of explain it, but it's talking about this process of offense and defense in debate rounds. And so we'll kind of break it down. Hopefully we won't go too fast, but please feel free to stop me along the way. And I'll stop myself along the way first, because we're talking about X's and O's, and there are probably several of you who are saying that you teach debate because you want to avoid anything to have to do with sports. So why are we doing this? I think that this hopefully is a very practical way for you to teach your debate students how to change their levels of argumentation. I think that hopefully what this will do is allow you to utilize some more I think advantageous ways to debate that hopefully will find you some success both in your local area and then hopefully even at the UIL state meet. And that's kind of the goal. Yes, ma'am.
Could you just repeat the tiny URL?
Yes, it is tinyurl.com/XOCC18. Okay, so before we really get going, I kind of want to introduce this by saying that we're getting close to dinner time. So you're probably thinking about a dinner option. I have a dinner recommendation for all of you. Okay, so here's a little bit of the menu. Okay, so you'll notice there's some great hors d'oeuvres, which I do know is pronounced hors d'oeuvres, thank you. It's got great caviar service and other things that you can't pronounce, so it's a good place. Judging just off this, who actually would like to go have dinner at this restaurant? Okay, and yeah, that's probably true. We're not going here, okay? Why we're not going here, let's look at it. Let's figure it out. So the question here is why are we doing it? Well, there are a couple of reasons why we won't go here. Well, you can't pronounce all the stuff. So that's probably a good reason maybe to rethink where you're eating. You might not like the food, right? And so it's not, if you're going to dinner, you want to eat good food, you want to eat something you like. You're probably not getting enough food. I noticed that it says truffle deviled egg. So not even multiple, one egg. So you're probably not getting a whole lot of food. It's probably how some people are so skinny. But probably the reason you're filing on is that your school per diem is probably a hug from your CFO. And if you pay this amount of money on a dinner, you're not going to be able to afford this month's car payment. And that's probably the reason why you're deciding not to go to this restaurant with me, because UIL is not comping it. So that's probably the reason we're not going to it. So yeah, and you're poor. So we're teachers, and like that's tough. So we're not going to this restaurant. I would tell you that the reason you're going, there are lots of reasons why we're not going to this restaurant. Okay, I would tell you that the first 3 reasons we're not going to this restaurant are all defensive reasons why we might not like this food or why we might not like this restaurant. Okay. If you can't pronounce stuff, that's not always a bad thing. There are some great foods that you can't pronounce. You might not like it, but you might like it. Like, you could. There's not enough food, but hey, you're getting some food. You could also just have a cracker, and that's not going to be good either. So I would argue that this is sort of like the basis. We're going to kind of start it from there. I think when we start to reframe the way that we are thinking about argumentation, and I prefer to do it in a sports mentality, okay, and the words that these, debate people of the past gave to it lend itself to a debate analysis, because we're going to talk about offense versus defense. And we're going to talk about how we can implement offense in debate rounds, how we can use defense but use it in a strategic way, but hopefully ways that you can steal some debate rounds, maybe get a couple of extra, improvements in your records at UIL State or something like that, and figure out how to do this adaptation game, okay? So we'll define these first, and we'll say that offensive arguments are going to be the arguments that you're making in a debate round that are figuratively scoring you points, okay? So they are generating some sort of scoring opportunity for you and for your students, okay? Defensive arguments, on the other hand, are going to be arguments that decrease the points that your opponents are going to score, okay? So I think this is a fairly basic way to understand it. We'll contextualize it a little bit more to debate in just a little bit, but this is probably the most basic way to think about argumentation. I would tell you that every single argument that you could make in a debate round, whether you're on the AF, whether you're on the neg, whether you're on a topicality flow, whether you're on a disad flow, every single argument that you could possibly make is going to fit into one of these 2 categories. An argument will either be defensive or it will be offensive. I think sometimes what makes debate difficult, or it makes it more difficult to maybe win some debate rounds that or you get ballots back and you're confused by the reason for decision or something like that, might come from a prioritization on defensive arguments and maybe a neglect of offensive arguments. Based purely on this slide, it makes sense then that the arguments that are going to have the most sort of bang for our bucks are going to be our offensive arguments. And we're going to talk about how we can develop offensive arguments throughout various flows in the debate round, okay? Ways that you can tell that an argument is defensive or not, you do want to ask yourself the question, does this score me points, or does it just decrease the points that my opponent's scoring? And you can look for some of these keywords. Offensive impacts or offensive arguments tend to be stated more comparatively. So words like improves, increases, causes, triggers something, makes it worse, makes it better, gives you benefits. All of those things seem to be either positive reasons to do something or negative reasons to not do something, okay? So anything that kind of, put synonyms into the tagline, whatever, change it around. If you can articulate some of these words, we're generally talking about an offensive argument. Defensive arguments are going to be more absolute, okay? They're going to be more black and white but without a lot of comparison happening. So you're going to say that things either does or will not, that the odds of something happening are low, that the impact is negligible, that something is exaggerated, or you'll start to hear some of those like hedging words that debaters use sometimes, like may, might, could, etc. And generally those are going to be more defensive arguments, okay? I do think that you can sort of pigeonhole arguments into either one or the other. There might be some, stray examples that fit somewhere in the middle, but I think this is a good way to kind of cheat sheet look for it. So again, we'll take a little pop quiz, okay? So this is kind of a nice role reversal for a lot of us. So Question here is the statement or the argument that's being made, of course, there was no evidence that I'm going to put on the screen. We'll assume that these arguments have been warranted and all that kind of stuff. But are these arguments that come up on the screen offensive or defensive? So let's take a look. Illegal immigration has a negligible effect on the economy. Is that offensive or defensive? Defensive, okay? This is taking an argument, right, that says, presumably this is a response to an argument, that says illegal immigration like guts or kills the US economy, okay? This would be a response that someone could make that says, hey, look, there is an impact. There is something going on with our economy. It's just not as bad as you say it is, right? You're kind of exaggerating the impact a little bit, right? So maybe there is a negative impact on the economy from illegal immigration. Don't know yet. Haven't gone to Rich's lecture yet. So maybe there is, but it's negligible. It's not really big. So while you might have claimed in the first speech, or more likely on the negative, I guess, that the economic impact of illegal immigration is like, I don't know, 6 million, billion, trillion, gazillion dollars a year, that it's really only like a couple 100,000. I don't know what the evidence says. That's not the point. The point is that this type of argument doesn't generate me any offense as the person making this argument. It decreases the amount of offense that my opponent is able to score. So if theoretically they were making an economics argument that illegal immigration has a huge economic impact, they're scoring X number of points, and it's totally arbitrary. You can assign a number. I like the bajillion gazillions. But you can assign whatever number you want. If you like smaller ones, fine, 10. If you read a defensive argument, it changes the amount of points scored. So instead of 10 points scored, you're only scoring like 1 point or something. So it's not like as good of an argument, right? It doesn't delete the argument though, okay? And that's the point of a defensive argument. The impact is still there. If this is the argument that I'm making in a debate round, I'm conceding that there's a negative impact on the economy, right? I'm conceding that it's there. It might be like a whisper or something, but I'm conceding that there's some level of impact there, but I'm making a I'm trying to make a strategic concession. This is the type of argument debaters make a lot. So let's get this one instead. Lessening restrictions on illegal immigration improves our human rights record. Is this an offensive or a defensive argument? It is offensive. This argument says that if we take an action, aka lessen restrictions on illegal immigration, it will cause something positive. So again, whatever point value you assign to human rights records, that's how many points you just scored with this offensive argument, okay? If only debate rounds were that simple and we had literal scoreboards in the background, it would make it a lot easier to judge. And those of you who are getting your judge track stuff kind of makes it irrelevant. That's not how it works. But this is still kind of a good way to say that. One of my biggest, and I'm sure one of your debaters' biggest frustrations debating is that they're not sure who's supposed to win the round at the end. They'll always say it's them. It's not always true. But they can't sometimes figure out the judge's ballot, right? They come out of the round, you ask them, you're like starving for information at the UIL state meet, and you're like, how'd the round go? And they're like, it could have gone either way. And you're like, sweet, that's going to satisfy me for the next 6 hours. And it's not. So what this is hopefully making debate is it's hopefully taking debate from a very, very subjective thing and making it just a little bit more objective. It's still going to be subjective, okay? Because we're never going to agree on the point values of these offensive arguments, and we're never going to agree with how much defense and all that kind of stuff, but it makes it just a little bit more objective. And that makes it easier for our students to handle. Okay, so yeah, you passed your pop quiz, good job. So it wasn't too hard, and you did well. But unfortunately, it really is not going to be that simple in the actual debate round, okay? So it's not just as simple as making an identification and then being like, hey, this was offensive, sweet, I just won the round, and you get to leave. You're going to have to do a little bit more than that in the debate round than just identifying these offensive or defensive arguments. So the ways that this becomes a little more complicated is the fact that X's and O's, or offense and defense, require comparative analysis, okay? comparative analysis is arguably a way more difficult type of argumentation than any other, right? It's very easy to argue objective statements, true or false, right? It's very easy to say, that I'm on a stage, or that I'm not counting, but X number of people here in this room. Those are absolute statements, and those are simple. We can make those. This is turning the debate. Instead of looking at more absolute statements or weighing absolute statements against one another, this is looking for a comparison. So specifically, how you're sort of determining how much offense an argument nets or gains, or how much defense the argument decreases the offense, or whatever, you're having to weigh this against, you're taking the 1AC and you're having to weigh it against the world of the status quo, or perhaps the world of the counterplan. Well, I'm going to probably generally talk only about the status quo, but that's also a case as well, right? So we use this type of decision making on a regular basis, okay? Y'all made this decision when you rejected my dinner choice, okay? Because comparatively to some of the other options that were available to you, you decided that my plan of going to Jeffries, by the way, if anyone's curious, of going to Jeffries tonight is not the plan that you want to endorse, okay? You would rather stick to the status quo, or probably more accurately, you do want to eat at some point, so you'll choose a counter plan, okay? And you'll go, hopefully not to McDonald's, splurge a little, but somewhere good, okay? But not, $150 for an appetizer. So we make these types of comparisons all the time. Your students already are making these sort of comparisons all the time. Every decision they make is a comparison, right? They internally weigh the costs, weigh the benefits. They usually choose the opposite one, but they're still doing it. They're still trying to determine what are the benefits of this action, what are the negatives of this action, and then making a decision for doing it. Hopefully you make that, you engage in this type of comparative analysis when you're deciding, whether to get another cat, or whether, unless you're Tim Cook, you just get it always. You don't think about it. But hopefully you're doing this on a regular basis. So this will require us sort of engaging in the debate round by looking at it first as one world is the world of the 1AC, or the world of enacting this plan text that's been advocated by the affirmative, and one world of the negative advocacy position. Now, saying that the negative has an advocacy position might be like a little revolutionary for some of us, but it is. A policy of not doing anything is still an advocacy. The status quo is still going to be an advocacy. When you're using an offense-defense approach to the debate round, you're hopefully trying to prove on the negative that the status quo is a more beneficial world than the world of the 1AC. If you're on the affirmative, you're trying to argue that the world of the 1AC is a better world than the status quo, okay? And that's where all those stock issues and things like that help you to do that, right? Your harms and your advantages and your solvency all help you to prove that the world of the 1AC is going to be a better place than the status quo, okay? So let's just let's step aside from the PowerPoint for a second. Let's give an example, right? Let's talk about economic impact, right? Let's say that I'm initially making an argument that I am going to, by doing the affirmative plan, I'm going to save, let's go bold and say, we're going to save like $1 bajillion, all right? Let's just say it. Let's speak it into existence, okay? I'm going to save $1 bajillion, okay? On a practical level, how many points have I just scored? A bazillion. I've scored a bazillion points. Like, I'm the automatic winner of the debate round. But that's just the first speech. So let's say that in the second speech, the negative speech, they tell me that I'm not going to save that much money. Like, I'm only going to save $200,000, okay? At the end of that level of argumentation, hopefully your debate rounds will be much better than this next year, but at the end of that line of argumentation, who has scored the most points? I still have. I've still scored 200,000. Yeah, it's not like 100 bajillion, mazillion made up number, but it's still 200,000, right? So the world of the 1AC is still a better by comparison, world than the status quo. All right? I kind of like to think of this as a plus-minus flow chart. If that helps you, right? You put all the benefits on one side, you put all the negatives on one side, you make a decision, right? That's the type of decision-making process that we are used to, that our, hopefully, students are used to, and if they're not, this is a great time to teach them a good life lesson. All that, right? To think of it as sort of a plus and minus flow chart, okay? Sometimes some offensive arguments are gonna score more points than others. So saving, 50 people is obviously more valuable than saving 20 people, right? I mean, that's logical. That's, again, more objective than subjective, like most debate will be. And then by the same token, some defense is going to decrease scores differently, right? It just depends on the argumentation that you're hearing in the round. But I think getting your students, and perhaps yourselves, to think of these arguments in terms of how many points they score or how many points they prevent is a really good way for you to make logical decisions about what world would I rather live in, right? It's a paradigm thing, right? It says that maybe at the end of the round, I'm thinking, which world is actually the better world to live in? I'm not saying that's the only paradigm for debating, because it's definitely not, but it definitely is something to think about, okay? In a game, and debate's a game as well, if you only play defense, how many points will you score? 0, right? You play basketball, you never take a shot, you've scored 0 points in the game, period. If that's true, how many points does your opponent need to score to win? 1. That's the great thing about sports, okay? JP will disagree with me, but that's the great thing about sports, is that I can look at the sports section and I can look at any number of box scores and I can figure out who won the game, right? There's no well, yeah, but LeBron scored 60 points and that's really good. It doesn't matter. Cavs score less than anybody else, they lose. That's period. That's bottom line, right? We don't do all this but they had a really good comeback. They almost won it. Cool. Cutthroat, you still got the loss, okay? And again, that's that objectivity that makes sports sometimes a little bit easier to digest for some of our students. Sometimes the subjectivity can get a little too rough for them. So I think that this is a good approach to doing that, okay? So let's talk about how we can generate offense. I think that you generate offense with types of arguments. I think that within each type of argument, you can generate offense on various flows. Hopefully this is where the bulk of this will come in, and hopefully it will give you some practical application. So you're getting close, you're wanting to score, you're wanting to actually get those points. How are we really going to do that within the course of the debate round? So let's start with your 1AC. Okay, your 1AC is the first speech for the debate round. It's the only speech that is 100% prepared ahead of time. I think as an affirmative team, you've got to take special care of your 1AC, all right? So the first thing that you need to ask yourself is, what is the terminal impact of the 1AC? If my 1AC does not get enacted, what is the ultimate terminal impact? If the ultimate terminal impact is people don't have jobs, right? Or farms aren't able to produce as much, or something like that. It's a good impact. It is offense. It's just not very terminal. The more terminal your offense is, the easier it's going to be for you to score more points than your opponents. Now, I know that some of you might be like, okay, slow down, though, because this is where we're getting I sneeze and nuclear war happens. And that's fair. Could be true. You never know. Could be true. There are other ways to figure out and determine these types of offensive arguments. But I do want to encourage you to find somewhere a little bit closer. You don't have to go all the way there, right? But a little bit closer. The odds are, if your ultimate terminal impact is that we lose, some farms, there's probably a greater terminal impact to that you're just missing, right? Maybe about food security. Maybe about hunger in particular areas of the United States. Maybe about the inability of or the perpetuation of poverty. Or maybe any of those things have a little bit more terminal of a story to tell, right? And that's going to be a lot more helpful. In the world of debating and in the world of this style of debating, Your advantages are sort of like congruent or the same as your harms. Maybe you've had a debate round or your students have had a debate round where this has been like a semantics issue and caused a great deal of confusion for your kids. So your kids are asking about harms and your opponent's like, we've read advantages, I don't know what you're talking about. Or vice versa, right? And that happens when we get to the state meet and we've got kids from upper part of the state debating kids from the southern part of the state and west and east and everywhere, right? Like we all learn differently, we all debate differently. I think that half of eliminating that confusion is just getting kids to understand that there are different ways that people are going to think about things. So typically in a affirmative case or a 1AC that's going to maximize its amount of offense, instead of talking about harm, you may not hear the word harms. Doesn't mean that they're not there. They're just trying to articulate it as these are the advantages of enacting the 1AC. That's also probably the harms of the status quo. It's just worded differently, that's all. So that's a good thing for your students and all that kind of stuff. What you're trying to determine here is how many points are you scoring? Again, this is totally subjective and kind of made up, but still trying to figure out, am I generating enough offense within my 1AC? Am I developing more defensive positions, right? Like perhaps my inherency, am I overspending my time there as opposed to my harms or my advantages? Am I really explaining my solvency to the point that I'm actually generating this offense that I'm claiming, right? And that's what helps you avoid those nuclear war debates, okay? What you think of it as, if this is how many points you're scoring, that's also how many points your opponents have to score to beat you, okay? If that number is fairly low, right, or objectively there's not a lot of impact, if I can listen to your case as a judge and I can say, I mean, all right, yeah, I mean, there's some good, but you know, that's the thing that we're trying to avoid by looking at offense versus defense, okay? Let's talk about how negatives can generate offense versus in the 1NC. So the easiest way to probably generate this offense is by reading disadvantaged positions or critical positions. I'm actually not going to speak about critical positions a lot, frankly, because I think at the UIL State Meet, it's just not advantageous. We do not use them at the UIL State Meet, period, just writ large. That's not something we do. We think there are other ways to debate, but these are the easiest to generate, right? And it's the very nature of it. When you read a disadvantage, what you are saying is this negative thing will happen if we do the affirmative plan, okay? So you're setting, I mean, it's set up to be an offensive argument at its there. The last part, or the impact of your disadvantage, is how you develop that offense, okay? But you have to have the other components to make sure that you're securing your offense. So you've got to have uniqueness. You've got to make sure your link is good. You've got to make sure you've got those internal links, however many they might be, because that's how you're going to secure your offense, right? And again, that's what's going to eliminate these all nuke war impacts on disadvantages, because those stories aren't being told correctly, most likely, all right? So you have to have the other components to make sure that they're being secured. A lot of times we don't focus on that, right? And we jump straight to the impact. We've got to still have the other parts to actually develop it. Reading a disadvantage, right, explains that if we, as a judge, as a room, as a debate round, whatever, if we enact the world of the 1AC, we are going to have to weigh all of the benefits of that 1AC against the implications of this disadvantage, okay? Obviously, we're going to have a debate back and forth about that disadvantage, whether or not it's actually triggered, all that kind of stuff. But on a fundamental level, what we are saying is that this disadvantage is so bad, that we do not want to risk enacting the 1AC, right? And that's what we kind of want to set up for us. Okay, we want to have enough impact generated in our off-case positions so that we can possibly outweigh the affirmative, okay? The second way that you can generate offense in a debate round is that you can read counterplans or case arguments, all right? And these function similarly, not exactly the same, but similarly. This is a good way to try to steal offense from the 1AC. most particularly by reading some sort of a counter plan or a counter advocacy. Just by the way, a counter advocacy is the natural way your students think. When your students are faced with making a decision, they don't evaluate one option and it's either that or nothing. They evaluate multiple options. It's natural. I would capitalize on that. I would notice the fact that thinking in terms of counter plans is very intuitive to the way that your students naturally are thinking. Okay, very few things in this world are either we do something or we do nothing. If we don't like the something, we come up with an alternative. Doesn't mean that this is the easy or the best strategy all the time, but it's an option. And it is a way to sort of steal some of the offense back from the 1AC. It does require very careful and strategic implementation. There are some rules that you'll need to follow with your counter plan. Tweaking one small thing of the 1AC is probably not a good counter plan strategy. Creating a counter plan that results in the same thing that the affirmative does is probably not a good strategy. So you are going to need a little bit more careful implementation. But what this helps you do also is it's going to help you prioritize offense over defense. What I mean by that, let's talk about case debates for a second. All right. So the affirmative has read this wonderful case. We've got inherency, we've got plan text, we've got solvency, we've got advantages, we've got all that wonderful stuff within the 1AC. My advice, if we're trying to debate in this sort of framework, which you may have to do at the state meet, then you want to try to prioritize your offense over your defense. It is very difficult to make an inherency attack an offensive argument, right? If my inherency argument is, well, we're kind of already doing this in this one small area or in this one small way, sure, that does decrease my offense, okay? But it doesn't decrease my offense by a lot. If that's the only argument that I'm making, if I compare the world of the 1AC versus the world of the status quo, the 1AC is still objectively a better place to be because I'm just focusing on defensive arguments. It's not helping me. On the solvency flow, running defensive arguments like, well, this isn't going to be 100% effective. Okay, it's only going to be like 70% effective. Or it's only going to be 30% effective. We'll be even a little harsher. If I read that argument, I'm not saying it's a bad argument to read, but if that's the only argument that I have, I am conceding that it's still partially effective, right? I am conceding that there's still something else to be gained, a positive benefit to be gained from implementing this 1AC. Now, if I combine that only 30% effective argument with a other argument about multiple policies create create ridiculous bureaucracies that slow the process down, I've combined that with at least something that's negative. And we can now weigh. But if my arguments are purely defensive on the case debate, it becomes very easy for the affirmative to just sort of dismiss them a little bit, depending upon paradigms. The last area where you can generate offense is topicality. And yes, I do think that topicality can be an offensive position. By the way, I always hate writing that word on ballots because I'll write that sometimes, like you need to be more offensive. But of course, they're not hearing me say that, so I'm always worried that they're reading you need to be more offensive. And I'm always concerned that like we're going to have a real problem someday and like some coach is going to come get me. So maybe I don't know how you distinguish. I don't know enough about linguistics. But yeah, I do think that a topicality argument is offensive. Okay? I think it can be. All right? It's offensive if you are focusing on instead the standards debate or the reasons to prefer of the debate. If you are only focusing on an interpretation and a violation, we're not getting very offensive. Okay? Yeah, you're explaining that under this definition, a case may or may not be topical. But we're not really generating like why does this matter? Right? Which I think is why we're getting some bad topicality debates. Right? How many of you like enjoy voting on topicality or enjoy hearing topicality debates? Anybody? Okay, there you go, one. So let's like make topicality debates like a lot better. That'd be great, because it's a very viable strategy. Okay, it certainly is a viable strategy. We certainly want our kids to be doing it. We almost teach it to them as like a necessary first argument in the 1NC, right? But if, in a room of 30 judges or so, only one judge like actually wants to hear that, doesn't seem like a good strategy. So maybe if we change the way we debate topicality, and instead we try to generate offense from that topicality argument, we might actually have some better debates. We'll talk about how we can do that.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. So I think realistically, where you're going to focus on getting offense on topicality, like I said, it's the standards debate. I think the easiest way to generate offense then is to think about the way that your interpretation better protects ground, limits, and predictability. To me, those are the three, like that's what I start all my beginners on in terms of topicality, because each of those are providing a very clear reason why you should be voting on this topicality argument. If I'm winning, that my interpretation is the best protector of ground, aka that if we vote under the affirmative, we are destroying the balance of ground between the affirmative or negative, right? That's an offensive reason to consider my topicality argument, okay? If I explain that we are getting, because the limits is better protected, the limits of the topic is better protected by my interpretation, which maybe provides us some more education, then I'm explaining a positive reason or a benefit to voting for me on this topicality argument. So often we kind of get like, well, topicality is a voter because it's a stock issue. That's fair. But if you are debating in front of a judge who maybe doesn't think that, which you might get at the UIL state meet, that's not necessarily going to help you win that argument because you're not explaining why this argument is offensive. Sure, I found a definition of substantially that says to be substantial, you have to be 98%. Okay? And sure, I proved in my violation that the affirmative is not 98%. How many people in here want to automatically vote for that argument just because those two things are true? Like, you'll do it maybe if you have to, but you like feel icky maybe doing it. Okay? So if I can then explain why this interpretation helps me to protect ground, or sets a fair limit for the debate round, or sets the best predictability. Because again, the whole reason behind topicality is a procedural argument, okay? To go along with sports. It's the same version of like your debaters throwing a challenge flag in the middle of a football game, okay? Topicality exists as a way to preserve the procedures of debating, okay? It is a way to preserve both the education and the fairness that we need in order to debate. Think of it this way. If debates aren't fair, no one's doing them. If debates aren't educational, no one's doing them, okay? Like we as a community, we as judges, we as debaters in that community, we've got to ensure that in order for debate to thrive, it has to be perceived by our competitors and everyone else as both fair and educational, fun and educational. If it's only fun, then like go to Six Flags instead of a debate tournament. If it's only educational, like wake up at 10 o'clock in the morning and read the dictionary. Like there are lots of other ways. For debate to be accessible and for debate to thrive, we need it to be both fair and educational. I think the easiest way to think of topicality as an offensive argument is to think of it as a disadvantage. It is a procedural argument. It's not a causal argument about like impact, like weighing impacts of implementation, but it's a disadvantage to the procedure that the affirmative was engaging in. So your interpretation becomes your uniqueness. Your violation becomes your link. Your standards, your reasons to prefer become your internal link. And your voters become your impact. And I think if you that really makes sense. Like if you really think about it, that really makes sense, right? So that's the easiest way to sort of put the offense into topicality. It probably does not come out as much in the 1NC as it does in like the 2AR and the negative block. But definitely something to keep in mind. So let's talk about those 2AC responses and see if we can get there. So for disadvantages, I've got some. You're good. Thank you, babe. That's my wife. Oh, so cute. You can drink it though. I mean, it's good. Oh, I'm scared. It's weird. She's an actress. That's odd. Okay, so let's talk about disadvantages. All right. So we know all the parts of a disadvantage: uniqueness, link, internal link, impact, maybe brink if we're still going there. We know all those parts. So theoretically, all of those are different arguments that I can make on a disadvantage. If I'm in the 2AC, I can attack the link. I can attack the uniqueness, I can attack the impact, all that kind of stuff. What I want to do, if I'm going to try to generate offense on those flows and make life a lot harder for my negatives, is at some point, I'm going to try to generate a link turn or an impact turn. So a link argument that is defensive would simply say, I don't link to this. That's not what my plan does. Like, I don't do this, right? You say that I'm going to spend a lot of money. I don't spend money. Okay, that's my defensive no link argument. That doesn't help me. I mean, it does help me. Don't get me wrong. It doesn't score me any points to say that I don't spend money. It just means that all the points that they thought they were scoring is now like down to 0. Probably not really 0, but like closer to it, right? So we call that a defensive argument. A link turn, on the other hand, is going to say instead of I don't spend money, I save money. I have now tried to create another offensive reason why you are voting for my 1AC, the world of the 1AC. Because instead of, not only do I not waste money or not kill the economy, I'm improving the economy. I'm helping the economy. So I'm making an offensive argument that I know the negative is going to have to respond to in the next speech. I'm guaranteeing that they will. I'm taking away some of their strategic choices by forcing them to respond to my offense. Okay? Same thing with an impact. You can make an impact argument that is defensive, right? I don't know. Like you could say some impact turns are just harder on disadvantages, in my opinion. But things like hegemony, right? If their argument is that your plan's going to increase U.S. hegemony and hegemony is bad, right? You could say, I mean, hegemony is not bad. Like, it's not all bad, right? That's a defensive argument, okay? When they say that hegemony is bad, I say, no, it's really not all bad, okay? That's a defensive argument. If instead I'm able to just tweak that argument, most likely, and instead of saying it's not bad, I say hegemony is good, right? I'm now generating another additional reason why you're voting for the 1AC, okay? Some people believe that if you are gonna utilize a link turn, that you have to include some sort of a uniqueness takeout. What we sort of say, or what some debaters may say, you may have heard this before, is that uniqueness controls the direction of the impact. So whoever's winning the uniqueness debate is controlling the direction or the arrow to which side it points. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind. Uniqueness arguments would then prove that like there's no causality happening in the world of the negative, right? So if I read a non-unique argument, it's a defensive argument, right? Saying that it's non-unique, but it says that I'm not causing this, right? Don't blame me for this, right? You say that like the economy is doing well. The economy is not doing well right now. The economy stinks right now. So all of your negative things about the economy, that's not my fault. It's already happening. It's already occurring. So don't blame me. You're not going to blame, like, judge, don't put this on me at the end of the round because the economy is already bad. That's my uniqueness takeout. The reason why some people think to fully execute a link turn is that you need a uniqueness takeout is because if I prove that the economy is bad right now, and then I prove in my link turn that I increase the economy, I have absolutely generated a new advantage to the 1AC. 100% done it. Okay? Second area is if they're reading counterplans or case arguments, you're looking for permutations. Okay? A permutation on the counterplan is any sort of combination between the 1AC and the counterplan. There are some schools of thought about some types of permutations that are more legitimate than others. That is a little too boring for us to talk about here, but there are a lot of different types of permutations, and notice I put the S in parentheses. You can always read multiple permutations to a counterplan if you're the affirmative. Yes, sir.
Do you believe in sticking with it all the way through, or like?
So I think most, again, it's going to be a paradigm question with most judges. If you're asking me personally, I think that permutations are a test of competition. I think that, like, in some ways they can become like something that you have to stick with, but generally I do not think that's the case. That's why I think it's legitimate for the affirmative to read multiple permutations to a counterplan. In the same way, I think that, like, that's a good check against all of these potentially abusive counterplans, like varying agent counterplans, 50 state counterplans maybe on this topic, stuff like that. I think that allowing multiple permutations is a way to force the negative to write a better counterplan. So no, I don't think you have to stick with all of them. I do think you can read multiple. I totally think that's fine. But again, one, so not gospel. The other thing that you've got to do in the 2AC is you've got to make sure and double check and see if there were any solvency turns ran. It's one thing for the negative to argue that your plan won't solve, okay? It's quite another if the negative is arguing that your plan makes things worse, okay? So if your opponent has any solvency turns on the flow in the 1NC, then you've got to make sure as the 2AC that you're prioritizing those arguments. I think it's appropriate if you're in the 2AC for you to kind of say, like, maybe sort of grouped, I mean, it all depends on the round, you understand. But I think it's appropriate to kind of say, look, the bulk of these arguments are defensive. They're not articulating a single reason why the inaction of the 1AC is a bad idea. So there is still a legitimate reason to prefer the world of the 1AC to the world of the status quo. But then definitely if there is offense generated, do it. That doesn't mean ignore the defensive arguments, right? That doesn't mean I'm going to say, like, I'm not going to engage in this, like, oh, I only solved 30%. No, I'm going to try to show why I solve higher than 30%, 100% or whatever. I'm not going to just ignore those arguments as the affirmative, but I definitely want to prioritize offensive arguments. And then on topicality, this is where offense really starts to generate on topicality. There are a couple of ways that the affirmative can make offensive arguments. Like I said, it's going to really, for me, center around the way that you're utilizing the standards debate. So again, what does your counterinterpretation do for limits? If I'm looking at the two interpretations as a judge, which interpretation is going to set the better limit for the debate round? No one wants to debate our topic where the affirmative is going to win every round, right? Like, none of your students would debate if that was true, okay? No one would do it. So theoretically, I want to have a topic, we all want to have a topic where the affirmative has just as much possibility to win as the negative and vice versa, okay? So if I can prove that my interpretation provides a really fair limit, like there are several affirmative options that are available, and there are still lots of negative positions that are available, right? That's good. That's a fair set of limits. I'm protecting fairness with my limits. I can argue that I'm protecting education by looking at, like, ground issues, right? Which is also fair. I mean, all kind of intermix a little bit, right? But again, no one wants to debate a topic that's going to be easier for one side than the other. And I think, the topic author, who happens to be a good friend, did a good job in the wording of her topic. I mean, they always do. Debate topics are inherently debatable on both sides. Like, they just are. But we want to make sure that we're doing every single thing we can to preserve that. And I think if we focus on limits, ground, and predictability, we're going to do that. There are other ways that you can generate offense. I mean, like, yeah, grammar can sometimes be an offensive reason. I mean, English teachers probably think it scores a lot more points than others, but focusing on grammar could be an offensive argument. There are small ones. I will say, as a personal plea, I think maybe we avoid reverse voting issues on topicality. Yes, that's a way that the affirmative can generate some offense on the flow. I think it's also the universal sign for giving up on topicality. So I don't think it's the most effective way to do that. I think that if you are focusing on reasons why your counterinterpretation provides better limits, ground, predictability, you're good. Now, there are defensive arguments that you can make on topicality as well. Hopefully you're making we meet arguments. Hopefully your students are making a we meet argument, right? That's not an offensive argument. It doesn't like make you any better. It just means that there's no harm, no foul. I meet it. Like I meet their interpretation. No harm, no foul. It's not an offensive argument, but if it's persuasive enough, it can go away. On the disadvantages, you want to make sure that you are not, and your students are not, reading impact turns and link turns on the same flow. Now, don't misunderstand. On one disadvantage, your student could read a link turn, and on another disadvantage, they could read an impact turn. But on the same disadvantage, you want to make sure that your students are not running both a link turn and an impact turn. And some people may be like, but you said they're both offense, like I'm running 2 offensive arguments, that's good. But it's kind of like that double negative thing, okay? If I read a link turn that says my plan saves money, and then I read an impact turn to a spending disadvantage and say that spending money is good, then I've now kind of contradicted myself and I kind of put myself in a double bind. Okay, so we don't want to do that. Pick one offensive argument on a disad flow, supplement the rest of your flow with defensive arguments. That's generally the best way to go. So yeah, this means that as a negative or an affirmative, like you've got a lot of decisions to make. Like this is where strategy comes into play. I think this is helpful for our debaters in terms of giving them, better life lessons for sure. But they've got to work on making sure that the decisions that they're making in round are the most strategic. This is a timed event. Time is one of those precious things in a policy debate round. If you've judged one, then you know why. Because they're long, but no, I'm just kidding. We need to have time and we need to preserve that time balance. So we know that there are if you think about the way that speeches are structured, there is an inevitable time trade-off that occurs in a debate round, okay? The last speech before the 1AR is the last series of speeches is the negative block. There's 13 minutes worth of argumentation. The affirmative now has 5 minutes to cover it. There is an inevitable time trade-off. It is not physically possible for the affirmative to answer all 13 minutes of a well-executed negative block in 5 minutes. So what the affirmative has to do in that 1AR is they have to make choices. They have to prioritize their offensive arguments over their defensive arguments because those offensive arguments are going to give them a higher return. The goal of the 1AR is just to give your partner a fighting chance in the 2AR. It's generally a good, if that happens, then you did your job. Could you do other things? Sure, but that's better. So that means that when we're getting to the rebuttal and we're experiencing this time trade-off that's naturally occurring, that we have to make sure that we are very focused in our rebuttals. The hardest speeches to give. That's why one of the drills that your policy debaters can do are rebuttal redos. You don't hear a lot of people talking about doing constructive redos. Rebuttal redos are where we can gain a lot of benefit. When we are time crunched, you do want to make sure that you are prioritizing offensive extension, not offensive extension, but offensive extension and refutation. Oh, that's embarrassing. Over defensive argumentation extension. That's embarrassing. If the only arguments in a debate round, in the rebuttals, if the only arguments that you extend or that are extended against you are defensive, how many points are you scoring or are your opponent scoring?
None.
None. You are not scoring any points. In a comparative sense, you have not proven why your advocacy is a better advocacy than your opponent's. Okay? That's not always the goal of a policy debate round, but you may encounter that paradigm or you may encounter that at the state meet or at your district meets or at your invitationals, wherever. So if the only arguments that you are extending or that your opponents are extending against you, it's 0 points. If those are my opponents doing that 0, then what do I have to do to win the round? How many points? 1. I only have to do a little bit in my last speech. It's like a breather for me, right? This is a little overwhelming for our debaters, right? You've done all this work. You've made all these great arguments. You may even have made true defensive arguments. But if you're getting 0 points for it, if you're getting no weight from it because they're totally defensive and your strategy has been 100% defensive, you're going to have those very frustrating RFDs where you think, oh, I clearly won this argument. I definitely won it. Your opponents may agree with you that you won that argument, but you're still walking around confused by the decision. And that's hard for people. So let's talk then about some adaptation at the UIL state meet. So I think Jana and the tab room, they love putting different paradigm judges on panels. I think they actually get a lot of pleasure out of it. So it means that for anyone to be successful at the UIL state meet, you can't just debate one way. I'm a firm believer in however you or your teams are most comfortable debating, debate that way. I am a stalwart defendant of the idea that you should not reinvent yourself. You should not change your ideas just because you're debating at state. I do think you need to go with what got you there. But I think there are some small changes that you can do to maybe help you in those rounds. Okay? There are reasons why they give us a paradigm booklet, and it's an actual very large undertaking for the UIL staff to create that paradigm booklet, and it's very helpful for us to really get it. The choices that we end up making in the debate round are going to decide whether we're successful or not. Okay? That's exactly how you win debate rounds. Okay? Now, I know that some of you are going to totally ignore what I'm about to say because I'm going to start talking about judges and paradigms. I know that this is not 100% accurate of all judges. I'm going to talk about stock issues judges or policy judges or tab judges. I know that you're going to have an experience that defeats this rule, defeats this convention. I know that. So this is just a general idea, okay? But I do think that generally this is a good characterization. So let's say that you identify as a stock issues debater, but you have a policy judge in the back of the room, okay? So you pride your bread and butter is maybe focusing heavily on case debate. Maybe you do like a lot of those defensive arguments. Maybe you like a lot of the plan workability things. That's kind of what got you to state. That's what you like to do. Cool. So if you are a stock issues judge and you have a policy judge, generally, again, don't ignore it, generally, not always, but generally, topicality is a lower priority in that round. Use this survey that we did a few minutes ago as proof. One person raised their hand for wanting to vote on topicality. Okay? So it is a lower priority, okay? Because a policy judge, hopefully by definition, is one that is going to evaluate the policy options at the end of the round. The affirmatives policy option is the 1AC. The negatives policy option is the status quo, counterplan, critique alternative, what have you. But let's say status quo for just sake of ease, okay? So topicality doesn't really fit into that. Topicality is a procedural issue. It's a rules question, ultimately, unless there is just something blatant. If you go in reading your case from last year, policy judge will probably vote on T, okay? But generally speaking, topicality is a lower priority, okay? Oh, whoops, sorry. So you do want to look for the offensive case positions. If you want to read stock issues arguments, great, they're awesome. They're really good arguments. They set a good foundation. But you want to find the offensive way to make those arguments. When you're reading solvency or you're maybe doing a solvency dump, which is a terrible name for that, but that's what we call it. But if you're doing a big solvency dump in the debate, try to generate some offense into those positions. Think about ways that the affirmative makes things worse as opposed to better. Okay? Try to avoid a lot of the semantic stuff it doesn't actually do this, or there are a couple of other, there are alternative things that also cause that impact. You don't solve for that thing. You only solve for one little thing, you don't solve for that. Because again, what are you conceding? You're conceding that they do solve for that one little bit. So just try to make some offensive arguments. It doesn't mean that you can't have defense. Defense is still good. But if you are only running defense, how many points are you scoring? 0. So find some ways to read some offensive case positions. I think you avoid inherency a little bit. I don't know a lot of policy judges that just love listening to inherency debates. generally is not going to give you the same return that it would getting you to state, maybe, if that's the primary way that you like to debate in your experience. Inherency arguments by nature just sort of argue that there's nothing preventing the plan from going into action, or that the plan is already being done. Doesn't prove why the plan's a bad idea. It just kind of proves that maybe the plan's not necessary. And that's fine. It's an okay argument, but it is defensive. So if that's like your go-to strategy, you might want to you want to kind of edit it a little bit. You can also think about external offense like disadvantages, and you can also think about other turns and other places of the case, even if you don't read full disadvantages, but you want to read like some simple turns that don't quite fit into solvency, but are negative implications of doing the 1AC. Those would be beneficial arguments. That functionally allows you to debate the same way that you have debated, but it's just going to help you prioritize in your rebuttals and in the construction of your speeches. It's going to help you prioritize other ways to be successful as well. And that's all it's doing. It's not changing or denying anything. It's just giving you another way. So let's say that you're a stock issues debater and you are debating with a tab judge. I think this is where, when you read topicality, which I think is a better option with a tab judge as opposed to a policy judge, generally, I think you do have to go beyond just the interpretation and the violation. Just because you have, I mean, how many definitions for words are there? Like, a lot. We could probably fill this room. Like, there's a lot. So just because you found one definition or one interpretation that excludes what the affirmative case is doing, that alone is not going to be sufficient for most tabula rasa judges. Because while it is saying, under this interpretation, a violation has occurred, there's no like reason, there's no like impact to this argument. There's no level for this. So if you are a stock issues debater, that's how you prefer to debate, or your students prefer to debate, but you're sitting in the room and you've got a tab judge in the back, you're going to have to go a little bit beyond the topicality argument. You're going to have to prove that there is a negative, like there is an actual in-round procedural loss caused by what the affirmative is doing, okay? And there's probably a lot of good evidence for, or got a lot of good reasons for this, right? These are those cases that you're kind of sitting in the back of the room and you're like, what? Like, how is that a thing? Or like it's a very, very small area of the topic or something like that. Like we used to, I don't know if the publication is still around, but we used to call them squirrel killers or something. But I do think you'll have to go beyond just proving that there is an interpretation that is violated. I think you're going to have to make sure that you also prove that your interpretation is good for debate. Like if we took your interpretation and we applied it to all debate rounds, it would be a good, fair standard for us to consider. I think that for a tab judge, that might be necessary. I think with a tab judge, you can definitely read defensive positions. I think that you can like sufficiently win on defensive positions because I don't necessarily think that a tab judge is going to be voting on this comparison between the world of the 1AC and the world of the status quo. I do think, though, you're going to need that justification. You're going to need to explain, maybe instead of just reading some of these defensive arguments, you're going to have to explain why this means that the affirmative does not uphold their prima facie burden, or like how they are kind of skirting around their burden of proof because they are not upholding this particular stock issue or that particular stock issue. And you can totally do that. It's just meaning that your debaters, instead of just saying, and here's my solvency takeout or here's my inherency takeout, it's then going the next step and saying, I'm winning this argument on inherency, but this is why it's going to result in a negative ballot, and kind of vice versa. I think you still can read external offense in turns, solvency turns, disadvantages, etc. Tab judges generally are fine with those. Let's say that you are a policy or a tab debater, because there's not a huge difference in how they debate necessarily, and you have a stock issues judge, okay? Personally, these are my favorite. I think, honestly, if we're being really honest with ourselves, stock issues judges, I know exactly what they're looking for. Like, these are great judges. because I know exactly what they want me to do. It seems very clear. They're telling me literally in the name of their paradigm what arguments they like. So what can I do? I do think that defensive arguments can win rounds. Like if you identify as a stock issues judge, you might have voted on an inherency argument before. You may have voted on the fact that the plan only solves 30% instead of the full 100, right? So all that's fine. As a debater, that means that you should use that to your advantage, right? If you're explaining how this means there's no prima facie burden upheld, or there's an issue there, then that's still a good argument. I think that a stock issues judge generally, I don't want to speak out of turn, generally views most arguments as all being equal, that there's not as much weighing between the arguments, that each individual argument that a debater can read is generally the same, or has the same weight, not the same argument, but the same weight. And obviously they're looking for a lot more realistic impact stories. And all of that is a good thing, right? Like we lament the ability for all of our policy debaters to turn sneezing into nuclear annihilation. So they are looking for these more realistic impact stories. They're wanting smaller impacts, but better link stories. They're wanting clear internal links on those off-case positions. All of that stuff is great. Let's say that you want to read critiques at UIL State. How do you do that? Well, first of all, I think this is a bold strategy. And it's not, I mean, I'll just be honest, it's not where like the strategy that I use is. I think what you've got to do is you've got to make sure it's relatable and digestible, okay? Critiques operate on a very hardline stance, particularly critiques that are based on like identity and things like that are a very hardline stance of argumentation that is sometimes very difficult to swallow. There's also just functionally a huge lacking in warranting in a lot of critical argumentation. And that's because a lot of our debaters aren't doing a lot of original research. They're not reading the actual arguments that they're put in front of them. Coaches or consultants or whoever are giving them a lot of good things to read, but there's not a lot of, there's not always, there sometimes is, there's not always a lot of really clear articulations. So if you're wanting to read critiques at the state meet, I think just make them relatable, very digestible. I think you can also phrase these as solvency terms. At its core, a critique is a solvency term, okay? At its core, when you're reading a critical argument, you are arguing that this is a prerequisite to solving for the harms of the 1AC. That functionally is what a critical argument is, or what a critique is. That some underlying assumption or underlying issue that exists is what is causing these issues. So that becomes necessary for us to really look at. So I think the realization, hopefully, of for me, thinking about offense and defense as every single argument is going to fit in one of these categories. Okay, it's going to be offensive, it's going to be defense. And I don't just mean a topicality argument is offensive. I mean different things on the topicality flow are either offensive or defensive. Different parts of the disadvantage are offensive and defense. That's a good realization because it gives us a lot more opportunities as coaches, and it gives our debaters a lot more opportunities to really experiment in debate rounds and practice at invitationals, etc. And it gives us a better way to reach a larger, diverse pool. When we debate only in one area of the state, which a lot of us do for most of the season, we're very knowledgeable about those judges, right? Because we start to see them all the time. We know what they like. We know what they want. It's harder when we get to the state meet because all we're going off of is a little paragraph. And that doesn't always give us the information that we need. I think these are very general ways. And I do think as a matter of practice, I do think that having a very clear offensive strategy, not offensive, but offensive strategy is helpful for your debaters. I think a lot of people, especially if you debate in an area that has a lot of maybe parents judging, which I think are great. We need more people judging. We need more like accessibility in this activity if we want it to continue to thrive and survive. It's a lot easier to explain offensive arguments as a reason why you're voting for me in the rebuttal, right? it's hard to explain why I've won this one argument, this one, defensive solvency argument. I've won this one argument, and that's why I totally should win the round. It's a lot easier to explain it in a comparative sense and really weigh the world of the 1AC versus the world of the status quo. I think that makes it a lot simpler. So I'm going to kind of stop. I think I'm ending a little bit early because this is a lot of stuff. I think there's a lot of information here. You do have the entire access to the PowerPoint to go through, and my email address is there as well. So like if you're, hopefully relaxing at some point this summer, but maybe in August when you come back to it and you have a question or concern, you don't know what's going on, then you can definitely email me. Does anyone have any questions right now? Timothy.
Is there such a thing as terminal defense?
Yeah, so I think that there can be, right? The problem is a lot of times what we phrase as terminal defense would just be an argument that instead of not just decreasing the amount of offense that something scores, it's taking it all the way down to 0. So it's completely eliminating the benefit. I think that exists. I think where we're going to find that, or the struggle in making that a good debate, is because we're going to have to go into the evidence comparisons. You're looking for comparative evidence still in terminal defense. You're not just looking for absolute claims that are taken out of context, because that's the easiest way for people to find some sort of loophole in terminal defense, is that the contextuality of your evidence is talking about this issue, but that issue is, or that context is not the context of the 1AC. So even if it's true that your defense is damaging to my offense, maybe it's not totally terminal. I definitely think that exists, but I do think it comes from having really good evidence analysis coming in the debate round as well, as opposed to just simply a he said, she said back and forth. Yes, sir.
Can you give me an example of a critique argument as a solvency term?
Sure. So I think one that a lot of debaters use, we hear it every year, is the capitalism critique. There is probably a lot of reality, especially for this topic, that our viewing of immigrants lies very solely in the way that we benefit economically from them, or the detriment that we have economically of them. The problem that I might argue is that when we are solely looking at the economic value of an individual person, or a group of people, most likely in this case, that it's, has some inherent problems with the way that we are able to solve. You might argue, or a debater might argue, that because we are so entrenched in ways to maximize individual levels of capital, that there is not a way for us to make an accurate policy that benefits immigrants coming into the United States, because whatever decision we make as the United States federal government will always be co-opted or rooted solely in our capitalistic instincts. So, in order for us to develop a policy that would successfully reduce restrictions on illegal immigration, we would have to then break out of our entrenchment of capitalism. I think that's possibly a way that you could do that. And of course, you're again very dense. We're looking at a lot of pretty complex literature for these types of arguments, so it is breaking it down in a good way. But I think that's still a decent argument, right? That all of these maybe harms of the way that illegal immigrants are being treated is maybe as a root cause being triggered by our system of capital. That's the reason why we either do want them or don't want them. If there's no economic impact, we don't probably care as much. When there is an economic impact, we probably care a lot. And it probably colors the way that we're going to implement policies. Yes, sir.
Yes, as I'm more or less a policymaker.
Cool.
And I heard a bunch of conditional counterplans.
Sure.
And as a policymaker judge, I am offended by
Conditionality.
conditional counterplans.
Well, so I don't think that that's wrong. I think that I can see a lot of policy maker judges thinking in that conditionality in terms of advocacy being especially problematic. If a policymaker judge truly is looking for the best policy option, then they don't want 100 alternatives, which is what's theoretically justified in reading conditional counterplans. You're wanting one very well thought out, very practical thing. I think it kind of ties into his question about conditional permutations, I think that a reason like that checks it, right? So because it's so easy to read a counterplan, it's so easy to change one thing from the 1AC, or it's, how many different actors exist in the world. I mean, maybe on this one it's not as much because we're talking about legal immigration, but still the number of actors that you can just swap in and not swap out of a counterplan means there's not a lot of depth that's always coming. It's not always a very well thought out. I think that's sometimes why multiple like a conditional counterplan probably justifies conditional permutations, but I don't think that's wrong. I think at the UIL State Meet as well in the Paradigm book, like there's a rating for how we view conditionality as well. And we're seeing a lot of people who want unconditional arguments to come through. I even think there are ways that you can not totally be unconditional, but just not be, we just don't like the people who are sleazy with their conditionality. And that's where it feels kind of dirty. TAP judges, on the other hand, probably okay with it because they view it as a strategic implementation of debate. And that's just where knowing the difference between your judges is going to be really important. But I think that's a good clarification to make in paradigm statements or pre-round discussions with the debaters about, yes, I like these counterplans, but I want them to be very, conditional, or I want your advocacy of these counterplans to be pretty good, pretty solid, right? Yeah, Timothy.
Other question about running the K as a solvency.
Yeah.
Do you think it's necessary to advocate an alternative at that level?
So I think when you're running it as a solvency turner, if you're trying, if you are a K team, you're a K hack, that's what you love to do, that's what got you to UIL State maybe. Huh? Okay. Yeah, it is. It kind of wrap up. We can talk about this stuff more. But what I would say is that no, I don't think you have to provide an alternative necessarily. One, because probably what you're doing with your critical solvency turn is you're deconstructing the idea. I think for probably a lot of stock issues judges, that's probably enough. And I think for some policymaker judges, you're still proving that there's a deficit to the 1AC. I still think you can generate offense without the alternative. Any other questions?